a simple drive through his own neighborhood, or a ticking time bomb waiting to explode. When a black man in a luxury car catches the attention of a biased cop, what starts as a routine traffic stop quickly spirals into something much darker. But here's what that officer doesn't know. This man isn't just any driver. He's someone with the power, the presence, and the courage to turn the tables. What follows is a collision of prejudice, power, and the fight for dignity, a confrontation that shakes an entire community to its core. And believe me, you won't see the ending coming until we dive all the way in. Before we get started, let us know what time you're watching and where you're tuning in from. Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're ready for a story that'll make you think twice about what justice really means, let's begin. Imagine this: a warm Savannah morning. The kind of day where the sunlight glistens off the cobblestone streets, where the Spanish moss drapes lazily from the ancient oak trees, and everything feels like it belongs to another time. In the heart of this historic southern city, Isaiah Carter steps out of his restored Victorian home, a grand structure painted in soft blues and whites, standing tall and proud just like him. Isaiah breathes in the salty air, drifting in from the nearby river. His eyes sweep over the intricate trim of his house, the wraparound porch where he spent countless evenings, sipping tea and watching the world go by. This home isn't just a house. It's the culmination of years of hard work. Decades, really. Every nail, every brushstroke, it all tells the story of a black man who worked his way through a world that wasn't always kind, a world that often told him no. But here he is, successful, respected, the owner of a home that once would have been off-limits to men like him. He smiles softly, his fingers tracing the key fob of his Tesla Model S, a sleek, deep blue machine parked right in front of the house. The car is spotless, shining under the morning sun, its curves elegant and purposeful. To Isaiah, that car is more than just transportation. It's a symbol, a reflection of everything he's accomplished. Late nights spent poring over blueprints, sacrificing weekends, working twice as hard to prove he belonged in a field that didn't always welcome black architects. Today's a special day. There's a community event at the local park, a gathering of neighbors and families, a chance to connect, to share, to be seen. Isaiah's dressed for the occasion: sharp slacks, a crisp white shirt, sleeves rolled just enough to feel relaxed but still polished. He's a man who knows how to carry himself with quiet dignity. Sliding behind the wheel of his Tesla, Isaiah takes a moment. His hands grip the leather steering wheel. The car hums to life, silent but powerful. He pulls out slowly from the driveway, easing onto the narrow streets lined with century-old homes and freshly cut lawns. The neighborhood is a blend of the old South and new beginnings, where gentrification has brought change, some welcome, some not. As he drives, Isaiah thinks about the speech he's prepared for the event. Nothing too fancy, just words from the heart, about community, about history, about standing together. He passes familiar houses, nodding politely at an elderly couple walking their dog, waves exchanged like currency in a small town. But as the Tesla glides smoothly down the street, Isaiah notices something in the rearview mirror: a patrol car, white and blue, Savannah PD emblazoned on the side, following just a little too close. He tells himself it's nothing. Routine. Just another car on the road. But the weight in his chest says otherwise. Isaiah's mind drifts back to the stories he's heard. Friends, family. Stories about traffic stops that weren't really about traffic at all. Stops that escalated into something else, something dangerous. But this is different, he tells himself. This is his neighborhood, his home. He's done nothing wrong. Still, he eases off the accelerator, making sure he's well below the speed limit. Hands steady on the wheel. No sudden movements. He's been here before, not here exactly, but in this situation, The silent calculation, the quiet fear that bubbles beneath the surface. The patrol car stays behind him, mirroring every turn. Too close now. Isaiah's stomach knots. His Tesla's indicator blinks as he signals a right turn toward the park, hoping the patrol car will pass by. But the flashing red and blue lights burst to life behind him, shattering the calm of the morning. Isaiah pulls over slowly, guiding the Tesla to the curb. Beneath the shade of an old oak, his pulse quickens, but his face remains calm, composed. Hands on the wheel, always on the wheel. He's rehearsed this 100 times in his head. Don't reach. Don't argue. Stay polite. Stay alive. He watches in the mirror as the officer steps out of the patrol car. A white man in his early 40s. Solid build, sunglasses hiding his eyes. There's a stiffness in the officer's gait. Something rigid. Something that makes Isaiah's breath catch in his throat. The officer approaches, slow and deliberate, each step echoing louder than the last. Isaiah's fingers flex on the steering wheel, forcing himself to breathe steady. He knows this isn't just a traffic stop. Not really. He's felt this before, that unspoken suspicion. That question that doesn't need to be asked but always lingers. What's a black man like you doing here? And in that moment, as the officer reaches the window, Isaiah's peaceful morning unravels. The bright Savannah sun seems to dim, and all that remains is the weight of history pressing down on him. This wasn't how today was supposed to go. But here we are, and what happens next will leave everyone stunned. So stay with me, because this story isn't just about a car or a stop. It's about something much deeper, something that speaks to who we are as a community, as a country. Drop a comment below. Tell us where you're listening from. Because stories like this, they happen everywhere. And they matter. Isaiah Carter kept his hands firmly planted on the steering wheel, his fingers stretching wide, palms open, every movement deliberate, rehearsed. The officer hadn't even said a word yet, but Isaiah could feel it in the air. That familiar shift, that invisible weight pressing down. The flashing lights still spun behind him, painting the inside of his Tesla with alternating red and blue streaks. His heart wasn't racing, not yet, but there was a pressure in his chest. The same pressure that always came with moments like this. The officer approached slowly, almost like a predator circling. His boots struck the pavement in steady rhythm, each step a quiet reminder of the authority he carried on his hip. He leaned down, one hand resting near the holster on his belt, the other tapping on Isaiah's window. The sound echoed louder than it should have, bouncing in the empty space between them. Isaiah pressed the button, lowering the window halfway. The officer's face appeared a square jaw, tight lips, eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses. His name tag read Beckett. License and registration. Beckett barked. His voice clipped, rehearsed, like a line from a script he'd recited 1,000 times before. Isaiah nodded, his face calm, almost serene. Yes, officer. May I reach for them? Beckett gave a curt nod, barely noticeable. Isaiah moved slowly, announcing every action like a narrator in his own story. I'm reaching into my glove compartment for my registration. Now my wallet for my license. He handed both over, his fingers steady, despite the knot tightening in his stomach. Beckett snatched the documents without a word, his eyes scanning Isaiah for something else, something more than just a license or registration could provide. You live around here? Beckett asked, flipping through the papers. Though the address printed there answered the question plainly. I do, Isaiah responded, his voice measured. Just down on Chatham Street. Beckett's eyes lifted, peeking over the top of his sunglasses for the first time, and Isaiah caught the glimmer of skepticism in them. This your car? Isaiah's jaw clenched, but he kept his face neutral. Yes, sir. Purchased it about a year ago. Beckett took a step back, his lips curling slightly, the barest hint of disbelief tugging at the corners of his mouth. He looked over the Tesla again, his gaze moving across the polished finish, the custom rims, the subtle details that screamed luxury. It wasn't just a car to Beckett, it was a challenge, a question mark, a puzzle that didn't fit into his neatly constructed view of the world. How'd you afford something like this? Beckett's words landed heavy, sharper than necessary. Laced with accusation, Isaiah inhaled deeply, reminding himself to stay calm, to not let the sting of that question crawl under his skin. He answered plainly, "I'm an architect. I own a firm downtown." Beckett paused, as if weighing that answer, judging it against his own expectations. His eyes narrowed, flicking between Isaiah and the car, as if trying to catch some inconsistency, some slip that would justify the suspicion radiating off him. A long beat passed before Beckett spoke again. "Step out of the vehicle." The words fell like bricks between them. Isaiah hesitated, just for a moment, not because he was unwilling, but because he knew what this could become. One wrong move, one word spoken in the wrong tone, and the situation could spiral. He swallowed the lump forming in his throat and spoke evenly. "May I ask why, officer?" Beckett's hand drifted closer to his belt, thumb brushing the edge of his holster, his voice growing colder. "Because I told you to." Isaiah's shoulders tensed, but he nodded. Understood. He unbuckled his seatbelt slowly, narrating every motion again. "I'm stepping out now." As Isaiah stood, the sunlight warmed his back, but it did little to ease the chill settling in his bones. Beckett stood just a few feet away, squared up, his posture rigid like he expected trouble. The irony was suffocating. Isaiah had worked his whole life to never be seen as trouble. He paid his taxes, gave to local charities, attended every town hall, but none of that mattered now. To Beckett, he was just a black man standing beside a car he shouldn't own. Beckett circled the Tesla, inspecting it like it was stolen property, kicking the tires, squinting at the plates, even leaning in to peer through the windows. "You said you just bought this?" Beckett called over his shoulder. "About a year ago," Isaiah answered. "You got paperwork for that?" "It's in the glove compartment. Registration's current." Beckett didn't check the paperwork yet. Instead, he pulled out his radio, speaking low but loud enough for Isaiah to catch fragments. Possible match. "Stolen vehicle reported." Isaiah felt the heat rise in his chest. He opened his mouth to speak, to object, but bit it back. It wouldn't matter. The officer had already made up his mind. His heart thudded harder now, not from fear but from frustration, from the helplessness of knowing he was caught in something bigger than just this stop. Across the street, curtains shifted. A neighbor, Mrs. Evelyn Whitaker, peeked out from behind lace drapes, watching the scene unfold. She didn't step outside, didn't speak up, just watched. The other neighbors followed suit. Doors opened. Curious eyes squinted from porches and windows. And in that moment, Isaiah wasn't just a man being pulled over, he was a spectacle. Beckett returned to Isaiah, standing a little too close, invading his space. "You mind if I search the vehicle?" Isaiah's brows knit together. "Officer, I've given you my documents. I've explained who I am. Why would you need to search my car?" Beckett didn't flinch. "Because something doesn't feel right." Isaiah's throat tightened. That wasn't a reason. That wasn't the law. That was bias wrapped in a uniform. "I do not consent to a search," Isaiah said firmly. Beckett smirked, as if he expected that answer. Backup's on the way, and just like that, the air thickened. The tension grew heavier. Isaiah glanced around, the eyes of his neighbors boring into his back, none of them willing to step forward. They saw him every day, smiled at him in passing. But now they were silent. Beckett paced in front of Isaiah, his radio crackling with static, calling for backup to a scene that didn't need any. But Beckett's mind was set. And Isaiah? Isaiah stood there, knowing that this wasn't about a car, or paperwork, or probable cause. It was about the color of his skin, about being out of place, in a neighborhood he called home. And the worst part? This was just the beginning. Stay with me, because what happens next will change everything. The hum of the Tesla's engine had long faded, replaced by the murmurs of curious neighbors and the crackle of Officer Beckett's radio. Isaiah Carter stood quietly, hands resting at his sides, feet planted firmly on the sun-baked pavement. He wasn't just standing there for himself anymore. He had become the center of attention, a man on display, a silent question mark in a neighborhood that was already too quick to form answers. The first few neighbors gathered cautiously. Mrs. Evelyn Whitaker stepped out onto her front porch, her arms crossed tightly across her chest, her eyes narrowing beneath the brim of her wide-brimmed sun hat. She knew Isaiah. She'd seen him at the community garden meetings, even exchanged pleasantries at the corner cafe. But now, with those flashing lights swirling and Beckett looming, she stood back, unsure, her gaze shaded by old doubts she'd never fully faced. More neighbors joined. A man walking his golden retriever stopped at the edge of the sidewalk, his dog tugging at the leash, uninterested, but the man rooted there, eyes fixed on Isaiah like he was waiting for something to happen, waiting for Isaiah to justify all this attention. Isaiah could feel every pair of eyes on him. Each glance, each whisper felt like a weight pressing on his chest. Heavier than the Georgia heat, he adjusted his shoulders, stood a little straighter. He wouldn't give them anything more to question, but the murmurs grew louder. "I've never seen him before," a woman's voice whispered from behind a porch column. "He's always driving that fancy car, but who knows where he really lives?" Another added, her tone dripping with suspicion. Isaiah heard them all. He always did, even when the words weren't spoken aloud. The looks, the silence, they spoke volumes. But today, those whispers weren't just background noise, they were daggers. And each one cut a little deeper. Beckett circled back toward him, holding the registration papers between two fingers, like they were something foul. He hadn't even looked at them properly. His eyes weren't on the paperwork, they were on Isaiah, scrutinizing every inch of him. "What do you really do?" Beckett asked, his voice loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. "An architect?" Isaiah nodded once. "That's right," Beckett smirked, turning slightly, addressing no one and everyone at the same time. "Funny thing, you don't see many architects driving cars like this around here." Isaiah felt the heat rise in his throat. He wanted to respond, to push back, to remind this man that he had every right to be here, that his money was earned the same as anyone else's, but he bit his tongue. He'd played this game before. One wrong word could be twisted. One wrong move could shift the entire situation. A young boy, no more than 10, stood beside his mother near the edge of their front yard, watching everything unfold, his wide eyes fixed on Isaiah, soaking in every moment like a sponge. Isaiah wondered what story that boy would carry away from this scene, what lesson he was learning just by watching a man like him be treated like this. Beckett leaned closer. "Step over here," he barked, motioning to the sidewalk. Isaiah obeyed, moving slowly, deliberately. He could feel the tension in the air thickening, the line between suspicion and accusation growing thinner with every passing second. "You sure this is your car?" Beckett asked again, like repeating the question would somehow crack Isaiah's truth. Isaiah's jaw tightened. "Yes, I've told you that," Beckett nodded, as if considering something, though the answer had already been decided in his mind. He turned to face the crowd, gesturing toward Isaiah. "You all know this man." The question hung there, suspended in the thick summer air. Silence. Mrs. Whitaker shifted her weight from one foot to the other, her mouth opening slightly, then closing again. Her fingers trembled where they clutched the railing of her porch, but no words came. Isaiah turned, his eyes scanning the familiar faces, the man with the golden retriever, the young mother with the boy, Mrs. Whitaker, but not one of them spoke. Not one of them stepped forward. He was alone. The man with the dog muttered, "Well, you never know these days. He could be anyone." Beckett latched onto that like a vulture to carrion. Exactly. Anyone. Isaiah closed his eyes briefly, steadying his breath. His heart thudded painfully in his chest, but his hands stayed loose at his sides. He'd learned long ago that tension in his body would only be read as aggression. "This isn't about the car, is it?" Isaiah said quietly, but loud enough for Beckett to hear. Beckett didn't respond. Instead, he spoke into his radio again, requesting backup for a situation that didn't warrant it. Possible suspect. Vehicle matches the description of a recent theft. He lied, his voice flat, mechanical. Isaiah turned slightly, catching Mrs. Whitaker's eye, pleading silently that someone would step in, that someone would speak the truth. But she turned away, retreating into the shadows of her porch, her face pale beneath her hat. The sense of betrayal hit harder than Beckett's words. Isaiah wasn't just battling one officer's suspicion. He was battling the silence of a neighborhood that had accepted him in small doses, at block parties and church events, but never fully welcomed him into their hearts. Beckett stood tall, feeling the weight of the crowd behind him, mistaking their silence for approval. His hand hovered near his holster again, a subtle reminder of power, of control. "You got something to hide, Carter?" Beckett sneered. Isaiah shook his head slowly. "No, officer. I've told you everything. I've given you everything." Beckett stepped in closer, lowering his voice so only Isaiah could hear. "Don't get smart. That won't help you." Isaiah met his gaze, calm but unyielding. "I'm not being smart. I'm being honest." But honesty wasn't what Beckett wanted. And the crowd they wanted, a show. Isaiah could feel their eyes on him, watching every twitch, every breath, waiting for him to slip, to give them a reason to justify what was happening. But he wouldn't. He couldn't. Because this wasn't just about him. It was about every black man who had stood in his shoes before, about every man who had been asked to prove he belonged, even when he had the keys, the papers, the life that should have spoken for itself. And still, it wasn't enough. Stay with me, because this moment, this is where everything begins to unravel. The heat of the Georgia sun pressed down on Isaiah Carter's back, sweat pooling at the base of his neck. Though the morning air wasn't particularly warm, no, it wasn't the weather. It was the weight of the moment, the weight of every gaze, every unspoken accusation circling around him like vultures. Officer Beckett stood just feet away, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the grip of his holstered weapon, his jaw clenched tight, as though daring Isaiah to make one wrong move. But Isaiah wouldn't give him that satisfaction. Still, the air felt tighter now, every breath harder to pull. The silence between them stretched on, punctuated only by the faint buzz of Beckett's radio, still crackling with static, waiting for backup that didn't need to be called in the first place. But Beckett wanted this, wanted the spectacle, wanted to turn a man's morning drive into something ugly, something public. And Isaiah felt it coming, the escalation, the shift from suspicion to confrontation. He could sense the familiar pattern, the rhythm of these encounters. It always began with a question, followed by doubt, then demands, and finally, force. Beckett wasn't just searching for stolen property, he was searching for an excuse to validate his own biases. Beckett took another slow circle around the Tesla, shaking his head as if what he was seeing just didn't make sense. Like the sight of a black man in this neighborhood, in that car, was something he simply couldn't reconcile. "I've got a report here," Beckett muttered, thumbing the buttons on his radio. "Dark-colored Tesla, possible connection to a recent theft. Matches this vehicle's description." Isaiah's eyes narrowed. "What report?" His voice was still calm but firmer now. "Because I know for a fact there haven't been any reports of stolen Teslas in this area." Beckett ignored the question, speaking into the radio again, requesting backup, possible hostile suspect. Isaiah's heart sank. Hostile. That word. It was a trigger. A weapon. Once spoken, it changed the rules. It painted him as dangerous, turned him into a threat in the eyes of whoever else was listening. He looked around again. More neighbors had gathered now, lining the sidewalks like spectators at a parade no one asked for. Some stood with arms crossed, others whispered behind hands. The lines were being drawn, and Isaiah stood at the center, alone. A middle-aged man at the corner, wearing khakis and a golf shirt, leaned toward his wife, whispering just loud enough for Isaiah to catch. "You see the way he's standing there? He's hiding something. Who drives a car like that without something shady going on?" Isaiah's fists clenched at his sides, not in anger, but in frustration, in helplessness. How many times had he walked past that man at the farmer's market? How many polite waves had they exchanged in passing? And now, here they were, neighbors becoming strangers. The moment the flashing lights appeared, Beckett's radio crackled again. Backup was on the way. Isaiah exhaled slowly, steadying himself. He knew where this was heading. He'd read about it, heard the stories. Too many times it started like this: a stop, a question, a claim, and then it spiraled. And now, with the words "hostile suspect" floating through the airwaves, the next officers would arrive primed and ready for confrontation. Beckett turned back toward him, the corners of his mouth twisting into a smirk that Isaiah knew all too well. It was the look of a man who believed the game was already won. "Spread your legs," Beckett ordered, his voice sharp, carrying over the crowd. "Hands on your head." Isaiah froze, not from fear, but from disbelief. He'd done everything right, provided his documents, explained himself, and still, here they were. At this, "I've complied with everything you've asked," Isaiah said, his voice steady but loud enough for the crowd to hear. "I've done nothing wrong." Beckett stepped closer, closing the space between them, his hand now firmly resting on his holster. "I said, spread your legs, hands on your head." Isaiah could feel the collective gaze of the neighborhood, heavy and suffocating. Not one voice spoke up. Not one person stepped forward to question what was happening. Their silence was deafening. And in that moment, Isaiah understood. He wasn't just facing Officer Beckett. He was facing every unspoken prejudice, every silent nod of agreement, every neighbor too afraid or too complicit to speak. "I've got nothing to hide," Isaiah said quietly, his voice firm. "Then you shouldn't have a problem following my orders," Beckett snapped. Isaiah hesitated, the weight of his choices crushing down on him. If he complied, he'd be submitting to a humiliation he didn't deserve. But if he resisted, even with words, the situation could turn deadly. He took a breath, lowering his hands slowly behind his head, his legs parting as instructed. The shame burned in his chest, hotter than the sun overhead. This wasn't just about compliance. It was about breaking him down, making him feel small. And still, the neighbors watched, silent. Beckett stepped in, frisking him roughly, his hands pressing hard against Isaiah's sides, down his legs, as if searching for some hidden justification. Isaiah winced but didn't move. The force of it wasn't about safety, it was about control. "You carry any weapons?" Beckett asked, voice dripping with accusation. Isaiah didn't flinch. "No," Beckett finished his search, finding nothing as Isaiah knew he would. But the look in his eyes said it didn't matter. The search hadn't been about finding anything. It had been about proving a point. A low rumble of an engine echoed down the street, growing louder. The backup had arrived. Another patrol car, then a second. 2 more officers stepped out, their eyes scanning Isaiah like he was already guilty. Beckett greeted them with a nod. "Matches the description," he said confidently. "Could be armed." Isaiah felt the ground shift beneath him. Armed? That word alone was enough to change the temperature of the air, enough to put hands on holsters, fingers on triggers. He turned his gaze back to the crowd. Evelyn Whitaker still stood on her porch, phone in hand, recording, but saying nothing, her face pale, her lips pressed tight. Isaiah met her eyes, holding them for a moment. "Speak up," his look pleaded. But she turned away, and as the officers tightened their circle, hands hovering near their belts, Isaiah knew the storm was only beginning. "Stay with me, because what happens next will leave you speechless." Isaiah Carter stood on that sidewalk, legs spread, hands laced behind his head, exposed to the eyes of every neighbor, every passer-by, like a criminal paraded for public shame. His Tesla sat gleaming behind him, that once proud symbol of everything he'd worked for, now reduced to nothing more than evidence in the eyes of those who watched. A car that, at this moment, seemed to hold more rights than the man who owned it. Officer Beckett's search had turned up nothing, of course. There were no weapons, no stolen property, no hidden evidence, because there was never anything to find. But Beckett didn't stop. This was never about facts. It was about sending a message that even in a neighborhood where Isaiah owned his home, where he'd paid his dues, he was still seen as an outsider, as someone who didn't belong. And it wasn't just Beckett sending that message, it was the neighbors, the ones standing on their porches, behind their hedges, peering out from behind curtains. Their silence spoke louder than Beckett's voice. Their stillness was an agreement, a quiet nod that said, "Yes, this feels right." Isaiah's heart pounded beneath his chest, his breath slow, deliberate, not out of fear, but out of necessity. Because any flicker of frustration, any sign of resistance, could be the spark that Beckett needed to turn this moment into something far worse. The other officers, called in as backup, positioned themselves in a loose semicircle around him, their hands hovering just inches from their belts, eyes locked on Isaiah like they were sizing up a threat. And all Isaiah could think was threat? What threat was he? A black man in his own neighborhood, standing next to his own car? But in their eyes, that was enough. The murmurs from the gathered crowd grew louder. A middle-aged couple leaned in close, whispering just loud enough for Isaiah to catch bits and pieces. "He must have done something," the man said. "They wouldn't treat him like this if he was innocent," the woman replied. Each word hit Isaiah like a stone to the chest. These were his neighbors, people he'd shared greetings with, attended block parties alongside. But now they were jurors in a trial he never agreed to, a trial with no evidence, no crime, just judgment. Beckett paced back toward him, the air between them thick with tension. "Stay right where you are," Beckett commanded, his voice rising just enough for the crowd to hear. "We're not done." Isaiah glanced sideways, scanning the faces in the crowd. There across the street, Mrs. Evelyn Whitaker, still standing on her porch, phone in hand. She was recording now, capturing the moment, but not intervening. Her gaze shifted away when Isaiah caught her eye, and that cut deeper than the search. Because Evelyn knew him, she'd shared stories with him at community meetings, smiled at him in the grocery store. Yet, when it mattered most, she stood silent behind her phone. Another officer stepped forward, taller, younger. His eyes were wary, flickering between Isaiah and Beckett. Isaiah caught that hesitation, that flicker of doubt, and clung to it. It was the first sign of humanity he'd seen since this whole ordeal began. But Beckett's voice drowned out any chance for reason. "We're going to search the vehicle," Beckett announced, turning back toward the Tesla. Isaiah's hands dropped instinctively to his sides, stepping forward. "You don't have my consent." Beckett turned sharply, his posture tightening. "Stay where you are." Isaiah stopped, but his voice didn't falter. "I've provided everything you asked for. My license, my registration. I've answered every question. You have no right to search my car without cause." Beckett's jaw clenched. His hand twitched near his belt. "I've got cause. Your car matches the description of a stolen vehicle, a description you can't provide." Isaiah shot back, his voice measured, controlled. Beckett sneered, closing the distance between them. You want to play smart. Isaiah held his ground. I want to know why you are treating me like a criminal. The crowd's murmurs grew louder now. A shift. Some of the neighbors exchanged glances, discomfort flickering across their faces. Maybe they hadn't expected this to drag on. Maybe, just maybe, they were starting to wonder, but Beckett didn't waver. Backups here. We'll do what needs to be done, Beckett declared. Isaiah could feel the rope tightening around his dignity, each word from Beckett pulling it closer to breaking. But he stood firm. He wouldn't let this man strip him of who he was. You're making a mistake, Isaiah said quietly. Beckett leaned in, his voice a low growl. The only mistake here is thinking you could hide something like this. Isaiah's eyes met Beckett's. Calm, defiant. I've got nothing to hide, Isaiah said. And in that moment, a gust of wind swept through the street, rustling leaves, stirring the tension. Isaiah's voice, steady and strong, rang out in contrast to the murmurs and whispers. But the most painful thing? Not one voice from the crowd joined him. Not one. They stood by, watching the scene unfold, their faces painted with doubt, suspicion, or worse, indifference, silent accomplices to injustice. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, his gaze flicking toward Beckett, then to Isaiah. That flicker of doubt returned. Maybe it was conscience. Maybe it was recognition that this wasn't right. But whatever it wasn't enough. Beckett turned back toward the Tesla, gesturing for the younger officer to follow him. They approached the car, preparing to open the door without consent. Isaiah's voice rose, this time louder, for everyone to hear. This is illegal. I do not consent to this search. But Beckett didn't even pause. The sound of the Tesla door unlatching echoed louder than it should have, a violation that sent a shiver down Isaiah's spine. His property, his space, his dignity, laid bare for no reason other than the color of his skin. And the worst part? His neighbors just watched. Stay with me, because this story is far from over. And what happens next? It will shake this community to its core. The tension on that street hung so thick, you could almost feel it pressing down on your chest. Officer Beckett stood at Isaiah Carter's Tesla, about to violate every ounce of Isaiah's rights, digging through the car without a warrant, without consent, just pure, unchecked authority. And Isaiah? He stood there, hands still at his sides, his heart racing, his mind screaming, but his face remained calm, because he knew that anger, that resistance, that even the smallest flare of emotion could be twisted against him. But just as Beckett reached for the driver's side door, a voice rang out sharp, commanding, unmistakable, "That's enough." The officers froze. Even Beckett paused, his hand hovering over the door handle. The younger officer beside him, the one whose eyes had begun to betray some doubt, turned toward the sound with something almost like relief flickering across his face. From down the street, walking with deliberate calm, came Captain Elijah Monroe, 60 years old, broad-shouldered, dressed in a neatly pressed uniform, his dark skin glowing beneath the harsh Georgia sun. His face, lined with the wisdom of decades on the force, carried an air of quiet authority that didn't need a badge to be recognized. And right now, he wasn't just wearing that badge, he was wearing every ounce of experience, every hard-earned lesson from years of policing a world that didn't always want justice. Beckett straightened up, squaring his shoulders, masking the sudden shift in the air, but his hand dropped from the door. Monroe approached with slow, measured steps, surveying the scene, the crowd of neighbors, their faces a cocktail of curiosity, fear, and complicity. The backup officers, tense and unsure, and Isaiah Carter, standing alone but unbroken. Officer Beckett. Monroe's voice was steady, low, but carrying enough weight that even the murmurs from the crowd softened. Care to explain to me exactly what's going on here? Beckett shifted, clearing his throat. Sir, one received a report about a stolen Tesla. This vehicle matches the description. Monroe tilted his head slightly, one eyebrow raising just enough to challenge that claim without saying a word. His eyes swept over the Tesla, clean, undamaged, its plates clear as day. Then he looked at Isaiah. "Missed Carter." Monroe greeted him with a nod. "Captain Monroe," Isaiah replied, a flicker of something easing in his chest. Respect, recognition, a reminder that not everyone in uniform was out for blood. Monroe turned back to Beckett, folding his arms across his chest. "A stolen vehicle, you say? You have the report number?" Beckett hesitated, fumbling at his radio. Thumbing the controls like that would conjure the evidence he lacked. "We're still waiting for dispatch to confirm." Monroe's gaze didn't waver. "So you've detained this man, searched him, called for backup all without confirming if there's even a report?" Beckett's jaw tightened, and his eyes flicked toward the crowd, feeling their attention burning into the back of his neck. The situation seemed suspicious. Monroe took a step closer, lowering his voice, but not enough that the officers or the crowd couldn't hear. "Suspicious? Let me get this straight. You saw a black man driving a nice car in a nice neighborhood, and that was enough for you to call in the cavalry." Beckett's lips thinned into a line, but he didn't answer. Monroe straightened again, his eyes sweeping the scene. "Did this man resist? Refuse to provide identification?" Beckett shook his head, muttering, "No, sir." "Did he raise his voice? Threaten you? Make any sudden moves?" Again, Beckett's shoulders slumped just slightly. "No, sir." Monroe turned back to Isaiah, nodding once more. "Thank you for your patience, Mr. Carter." Isaiah returned the nod, but the tension in his jaw remained. "Patience only goes so far, Captain." Monroe offered a small smile, one that held no joy. "I understand." The younger officer, the one who'd been wavering this whole time, stepped closer, clearing his throat. "Captain Monroe, permission to speak." Monroe gestured for him to continue. "I checked the plates when we arrived," the young officer said, glancing toward Beckett. "Everything checks out. No reports. No flags." Monroe nodded, as though he already knew. "Thank you, Officer Davis." Beckett turned toward Davis, glaring, but Davis stood firm, his jaw tightening with something like resolve. Monroe's gaze swept across the gathered crowd again, landing briefly on Mrs. Whitaker, whose phone still hovered at chest height, recording everything. She flinched slightly when Monroe's eyes met hers, but didn't lower her phone. "Let's be clear," Monroe said, his voice rising just enough to carry across the street. "This man has done nothing wrong. There is no stolen vehicle report. There is no threat here." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Some exchanged glances. Others looked away, their complicity starting to crack beneath the weight of the truth. Monroe turned back to Beckett, his voice lower now, but sharper. "You've escalated a situation that didn't need escalating. You've turned a man's drive through his own neighborhood into a public spectacle." Beckett opened his mouth, but Monroe cut him off with a wave of his hand. "You know what the worst part is, Officer Beckett?" Monroe's eyes narrowed, his voice steady as stone. "You've reminded this community of every reason they fear the badge, and you've made our job, my job, harder." Beckett's jaw clenched, but there was no comeback, no justification. Monroe turned back to Isaiah. "Missed Carter, again my apologies." Isaiah met his gaze, the anger simmering beneath his calm, finally breaking through. "Captain, with all due respect, an apology doesn't undo what just happened." Monroe nodded slowly. "I know, but it's a start." Isaiah shook his head, taking a breath. "I don't need a start. I need accountability." The words hung there, heavy, truthful, and as Monroe stood silently, the crowd began to murmur again, only this time. It wasn't about Isaiah. It was about the officer who'd stood exposed in front of them. But this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Stay with me, because the storm is far from passing. And what comes next? It's going to test the very foundation of this neighborhood. The street felt like it was holding its breath. Neighbors frozen on their porches, officers standing stiff beneath the weight of silence. The Georgia sun, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. Captain Elijah Monroe stood face to face with Officer Beckett, neither man speaking for a moment, but the tension between them, as thick as the humidity in the air. Isaiah Carter stood just behind Monroe, his body rigid, his mind racing. Even with Monroe's intervention, the knot in his chest hadn't loosened, because he knew too well how moments like these could twist, how one wrong word, one flash of ego or defiance could turn the tide back against him. Beckett shifted his weight, his jaw clenched tight. His authority had been challenged publicly, and it showed in the way his eyes narrowed, in the way his hand still hovered too close to his belt. But Monroe didn't flinch. He stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Officer Beckett," Monroe began, his eyes locked onto the younger officer, "explain to me again why you pulled Mr. Carter over." Beckett swallowed hard. The crowd, though still, leaned in ever so slightly, waiting for his answer. He cleared his throat, but the confidence that had filled his voice earlier was gone. "He was driving suspiciously," Beckett muttered, though it sounded hollow even to himself. A vehicle matching this description was flagged in a nearby theft report. Monroe didn't blink. "Do you have the report number?" We're still waiting on dispatch," Beckett stammered. Monroe tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable, but there was something in his gaze that made even the backup officers shift uncomfortably. "Let's be clear," Monroe said, his voice carrying over the heads of the silent crowd. "There is no active report matching this vehicle." Officer Davis confirmed the plates. This stop was baseless. The words landed heavy. Beckett opened his mouth, as if to argue, but snapped it shut, his lips pressed into a hard line. His face flushed red beneath the sun, but whether it was anger or shame, Isaiah couldn't tell. Monroe turned to the backup officers. "Dismissed," he said simply, and one by one, they hesitated, then nodded, walking back toward their patrol cars. Officer Davis, the younger one who'd been wavering all along, lingered for a moment, his gaze meeting Isaiah's before he finally turned away, guilt written across his face. But Beckett didn't move. He stood his ground, his feet planted like roots, his hands still too close to his holster. His pride wouldn't let him back down. Monroe stepped closer, his voice dropping low, meant only for Beckett's ears, but loud enough for the tension to ripple across the crowd. "You've got two choices here," Monroe said, his tone even. "Admit you were wrong and let this man go, or keep digging a hole so deep you'll never climb out." Beckett's fists clenched at his sides. He turned his head slightly, casting a glance at the crowd, their eyes watching, judging, waiting. For the first time, it wasn't Isaiah they were scrutinizing. It was him! But then, Beckett straightened his spine, forcing a smirk onto his face. "I still think something's off," he muttered. And just like that, the hope Isaiah had felt at Monroe's arrival wavered. Beckett wasn't backing down. He couldn't admit he was wrong. Not here. Not now. Not with the crowd watching. Monroe let out a breath, shaking his head. "You're not listening, son. I know men like him," he spat, gesturing toward Isaiah, driving around like they own the place. Thinking they're above suspicion. Isaiah's jaw clenched, his teeth grinding behind closed lips. The words cut deeper than the frisk, deeper than the search of his car, because Beckett wasn't just questioning his ownership of the car, he was questioning his place in the world. "I've lived here longer than you've been on the force," Isaiah said, his voice low but steady. "And you still don't see me." Beckett's eyes flashed, but Monroe stepped between them, holding up a hand. "Enough," Monroe said firmly. "This stops now." But Beckett wasn't done. His voice rose, angling toward the crowd. "You don't know what kind of people come through this neighborhood. They don't belong here." The words were like gasoline on a fire. A ripple of discomfort spread through the crowd. Some neighbors shifted on their porches, their faces tightening, their arms folding tighter across their chests. The people he'd shared block parties with, exchanged greetings with on morning walks. But now, some wouldn't even meet his gaze. "This isn't right," a man's voice called out. All heads turned. It was Officer Davis, standing near his patrol car, his face pale but resolute. His voice trembled slightly, but he kept speaking. "Missed?" And this isn't just about him. Beckett's eyes burned toward Davis, but the young officer stood firm. Isaiah felt his breath catch. It wasn't everything, but it was something. Monroe nodded at Davis, then turned back to Beckett. "You hearing this, son?" Beckett's jaw twitched, but the smirk was gone. Monroe stepped forward, closing the space between them. "You can keep pushing, but know this: you're standing alone now." For the first time, Beckett faltered. His eyes flicked toward the crowd, toward Davis, and even Mrs. Whitaker, still filming with her phone. And then, quietly, Monroe turned to Isaiah. "I'd like to make this right," he said. Isaiah met his gaze, the weight of the moment pressing on him. "I appreciate that, Captain, but making it right doesn't start with me." And with that, the confrontation paused, but the damage had been done. The neighborhood had been shaken, the silence broken. But this story? It wasn't over yet. Stay with me, because the next step will either heal this community or tear it apart. The air felt heavy with something unspoken, a kind of weight that settled over the street, like a storm that hadn't yet broken. Isaiah Carter stood in the middle of it all, the flashing lights of patrol cars painting the scene in red and blue, his Tesla sitting there untouched. But accused, the crowd of neighbors, the officers, Captain Monroe, and Officer Beckett, they were all players in a moment that none of them would ever forget. But the moment that changed everything? It came quietly. It wasn't a grand speech. It wasn't a sudden act of violence. No, it came from something simple, something so powerful in its ordinariness, a voice from across the street. Mrs. Evelyn Whitaker lowered her phone, her hands trembling just slightly. She had recorded everything: the stop, the search, the accusations, the humiliation. Every word spoken in that heated exchange was preserved in digital memory. She had stood silently for too long, but now she stepped forward. "I have this on video," she said, her voice soft but clear. Beckett turned toward her, his expression shifting for the first time since this began. His bravado cracked, just a hairline fracture, but enough to see through. "I've recorded the entire thing," Evelyn continued, lifting her phone higher, her gaze steady now. "From the moment you stopped him, from the moment you accused him." The crowd shifted. People who had stood quietly, some with arms folded, others murmuring behind their hands, they turned. Eyes flicked from Isaiah to Evelyn, to Beckett, to Monroe. The silence began to crumble. Monroe nodded toward Evelyn. "Would you mind sending that to me?" Evelyn gave a small nod, her lips pressing together tightly, as though she were holding back a storm of emotions. She wasn't a hero. She wasn't someone used to standing at the center of attention. But today, she knew she had to do something. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was the growing realization that silence had been part of the problem all along. "I'll send it," she replied, her voice firmer now. Beckett's face turned red, his hands balling into fists. "That video doesn't tell the whole story," he snapped. "You don't know what it's like out here," Monroe stepped in, before Beckett could spiral further. "We know exactly what's happened out here, officer. And the video shows it. The video tells a story we can't ignore." Isaiah turned, facing the crowd, his voice low but steady. "You all saw what happened here. You watched it. But only one of you stepped forward." His words weren't angry. They weren't even bitter. They were filled with something else: disappointment. A deep, soul-crushing disappointment that settled on his shoulders, like a weight he'd carried too many times before. A neighbor, a man who had been standing near the corner, arms crossed, head bowed, spoke up, his voice rough. We didn't know it was like that. Isaiah shook his head slowly. You knew. You just didn't want to see it. The crowd stirred again. Some faces flushed with shame. Others tightened with defensiveness. But no one spoke. No one denied it. Evelyn lowered her phone, finally finding the courage to meet Isaiah's eyes. I should have said something sooner, she said softly. Isaiah offered a slight nod, but the pain behind his eyes didn't soften. It matters that you're saying it now. Monroe took a step toward Beckett, his voice cool and measured. Officer Beckett, consider yourself relieved of duty for the remainder of this investigation. We will be reviewing everything. The stop, the search, the video. Beckett bristled. You're siding with him. I'm siding with the truth, Monroe said, firmly. The weight of those words landed heavy. No one in that crowd could deny it any longer. The truth wasn't about opinions. It wasn't about suspicions. It wasn't even about the car. It was about what everyone had just witnessed: a man accused, humiliated, judged for nothing more than existing. Isaiah turned back toward his Tesla, his hand resting lightly on the hood. For a moment, the car felt like both a symbol of pride and a symbol of what had drawn this storm down upon him. Something so simple, something he worked so hard to achieve, had been twisted into a weapon against him. But as the dust settled, the real shift began, not with Beckett stepping back, not even with Monroe taking control, but with the crowd. A neighbor, an older man, gray at the temples, who had stood silent the whole time, took a step forward. I'm sorry, he said, his voice cracking. I should have spoken up. Another voice joined in. Me too. We didn't know what to say. Isaiah nodded once. You know now. And that acknowledgement, it cracked something open. Because this wasn't just about a bad stop. It wasn't just about one officer's actions. It was about the silence that let it happen. The silence that allowed it to fester. And now, that silence was breaking. Evelyn, still clutching her phone, raised it again, but not to record this time. She opened her social media app, her hands steady. She uploaded the video, captioning it simply, "This happened in our neighborhood today. We can't stay silent anymore." Within moments, the notifications began to light up her screen. Monroe turned to Isaiah, his face lined with the weight of responsibility. There will be an investigation. We'll make this right. Isaiah met his gaze, the weight of the day pressing into every word. It's going to take more than an investigation to make this right. Monroe nodded, knowing Isaiah was right. The crowd slowly began to disperse, but something was different now. The neighbors walked away with their heads low, their faces thoughtful, their steps slower. Some glanced back at Isaiah, not with suspicion, but with the realization that they had been part of the problem. And Beckett? He stood there, his authority stripped bare, his pride bruised but intact. He didn't apologize. He didn't back down, but the look in his eyes, that flicker of uncertainty, said everything. Isaiah leaned against his Tesla, the day's weight settling into his bones. But he didn't falter. He stood tall, because this wasn't just about him anymore. Stay with me, because the story doesn't end here. It's only just beginning. The video Mrs. Evelyn Whitaker uploaded, it didn't just stay in the neighborhood. No, within hours, it started to circulate on Facebook, Twitter, local news blogs. It was shared and reshared, the caption burning like a quiet confession. This happened in our neighborhood today. We can't stay silent anymore. And just like that, the story wasn't just Isaiah Carter's. It belonged to anyone who had ever felt the weight of suspicion on their back for simply existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. By evening, the local news had picked it up. A reporter stood outside the same street where it all happened. The quiet suburban homes now serving as the backdrop for a story that couldn't be ignored. Neighbors, who had turned away hours earlier, found themselves on the edge of something bigger. They'd been passive witnesses, but now they were part of the narrative. And for some, that reality stung more than they expected. Isaiah watched from his living room, his Tesla parked safely outside, but every time the footage played back, Beckett ordering him out of the car, forcing him into that humiliating stance, treating him like less than a man, it hit him like a fresh wound. Over and over. The world was seeing it now. The world was reacting. The town's mayor released a statement the next morning, calling for calm and patience while the situation is investigated. But those words felt hollow, as if patience hadn't already been demanded from people like Isaiah, time and time again. Patience while dignity was stripped, patience while apologies replaced accountability. But Isaiah wasn't willing to wait this time. Captain Monroe reached out, requested a meeting. Not in private, not behind closed doors. No, this meeting would be public. A town hall. Open invitation. Neighbors, officers, journalists, the whole community. And Isaiah agreed, because if this wound was going to heal, if it even could, it had to be exposed fully. No more whispers, no more hiding behind curtains. The town hall took place at the local community center, a space usually reserved for bake sales, charity drives, and local events. But tonight, it buzzed with something different. The air was thick with unease. Like a crowd gathered before a storm, Isaiah sat at the front, his back straight, eyes forward. Missing, of course, was Officer Beckett. Suspended, pending investigation. The chairs filled quickly. Neighbors who had stood silent on their porches now sat here, their faces a mixture of guilt, curiosity, and defensiveness. Some came ready to listen. Others came ready to argue. Monroe stepped to the microphone first. "I know why we're here," he began, his voice steady, practiced. "And I know many of you are angry. Some of you are confused, maybe even afraid." He paused, scanning the room. What happened on Chatham Street wasn't just a traffic stop gone wrong. It was a failure of judgment, a failure of duty, and a failure of community. The words landed, some nodded slowly, others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "I've served this town for 35 years, Monroe continued, "and I've always believed that the badge stands for protection, for fairness. But I also know that belief doesn't always match the reality." He glanced toward Isaiah, giving him the floor. Isaiah rose, the eyes of the room fixed on him. But he didn't flinch. He'd stood alone on that sidewalk. Standing here wasn't nearly as hard. "My name is Isaiah Carter," he began, his voice strong, "and you all know who I am. Some of you have lived next door to me for years. We've shared conversations, small talk at the grocery store, polite waves at the mailbox. But when those lights flashed behind my car, none of that mattered. The room went still. Not one person stepped forward when I needed you," Isaiah said, his voice softening. Not one voice spoke up. Murmurs spread. Some heads bowed. A few faces hardened. "But here's the thing," Isaiah continued. "This isn't about one bad cop. It's about the silence that let him think what he did was okay. The silence that let him believe no one would challenge him." He scanned the room, locking eyes with the same neighbors who had stood frozen on their porches. "We all play a part in what happened that day. Because the truth is, you didn't see me. Not really." A hand raised in the back. A man middle-aged, the same one who'd whispered to his wife during the stop, stood slowly. I didn't know what to do," he admitted, his voice tight. "I didn't want to make it worse." Isaiah nodded. "I get that." But saying nothing that did make it worse, silence settled again, deeper this time. Evelyn Whitaker stood next. She cleared her throat, her phone still in hand, though she wasn't recording now. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 30 years, she said, softly. "And I thought I was fair, thought I wasn't part of the problem." She paused, shaking her head. "But standing on my porch, watching that happen to Isaiah, I realized I've been silent too long. I've looked the other way. And I'm sorry." The words hung there. Real, heavy. Isaiah nodded slowly. accepting her words not as an ending, but as a beginning. Monroe stepped forward again. The department is reviewing its policies. There will be accountability, but I know that's not enough. He glanced around the room. It starts here, with all of us. We have to do better. See each other. Speak up for each other, Isaiah spoke one final time, his voice carrying a quiet power. I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for equal treatment, for dignity, for the right to drive my car through my neighborhood without fear. And in that room, for the first time, the silence felt different. Not complicity, but reflection. Stay with me because the fight isn't over. But tonight, something shifted. So what can we take away from Isaiah Carter's story? It's not just about one man or one neighborhood. It's about all of us, about how easy it is to stay silent when we see something wrong, and how much courage it takes to speak up. For many watching, especially those of us who've lived through decades of change, it's a reminder that the fight for justice isn't something we retire from. It's something we carry forward. Whether you've marched in the streets or simply nodded at the news, this story asks one question. When the moment comes, will you stand silent or will you stand up? Because silence, as we've seen, can be just as harmful as action. And here's the truth. None of us are too old to make a difference. Whether it's speaking out at a community meeting, checking in on a neighbor, or just asking questions when something doesn't feel right. Change doesn't come from grand gestures. It comes from everyday courage. If this message speaks to you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories just like this. Together, we can keep these conversations going.